Henry Wallace was President Franklin Roosevelt's vice president during his third term, 1941 to 1945. FDR then chose Harry Truman to be his vice president in the fourth and last term. In author Benn Steil's book, The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century, he writes that Wallace loved humankind, but was mostly vexed or bored by humans. Steil takes us through Wallace's life, from Iowa farm boy to presidential candidate on the progressive ticket in 1948. Wallace preached the supremacy of human rights over property rights, yet excused the absence of human rights in Russia. Benn Steil, how did Henry Wallace become vice president of the United States?
Well, Henry Wallace was basically a member of what you might call, at the time, the Iowan agricultural aristocracy. His grandfather had founded a very influential farm journal called Wallace's Farmer, which we might liken to a publication like, say, Barron's in the financial community in the 1980s, essential reading, in this case for people who were farmers, not just technical details of farming, but all the moral and political and economic opinions that should attach to farming during that period. His father, also a Henry, the firstborn son in the Wallace family, was always a Henry, took over the paper after his grandfather died, and eventually became agriculture secretary under Harding and Coolidge. So when Roosevelt was looking for an agriculture secretary, Henry Wallace, the grandson, was a logical place to turn. The Henry Wallace of my narrative, also became editor of Wallace's Farmer, was a remarkably talented agricultural geneticist, really self-taught. Even before he went to college, he was experimenting with hybridizing corn, and much of the corn that we eat today derives from his fascinating experiments. So he was a logical place to turn, but he was not a politician, and really never grew into the role of politician.
You say that John Lewis Gaddis, professor, Yale, I gather with you on the Council on Foreign Relations, suggested that you should write this book. What was his reason?
Yeah, so I thought I was a very unlikely person to write such a book. I'm a financial economist by training, but 2 books ago, I had written an historical narrative on Bretton Woods, on the Bretton Woods Agreement that created the IMF and the World Bank and the dollar-based international monetary system. And over the course of that research, I became fascinated with early Cold War history, because it turned out that Harry Dexter White, the Treasury representative who had been primarily responsible for the conference, was a major Soviet asset. And I had discovered fascinating things about him, for example, using the FBI archives. I then decided to do another Cold War economic story, a historical narrative on the Marshall Plan. And while I was researching that book, I did several pilgrimages to Yale to speak to Professor Gaddis about George Kennan, who was, of course, a major biographical subject of Gaddis. And Gaddis had urged me to consider, after doing the Marshall Plan, writing a political biography of Henry Wallace. And his reasoning was that Wallace had become almost an iconic figure among idealistic, very smart young people around the United States. And one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, was Oliver Stone, the documentary filmmaker, who way back in 2012 had done what he would call a documentary, The Untold History of the United States, in which he argued that if Henry Wallace had kept his rightful place on the Democratic ticket in 1944 as FDR's vice president, that, of course, he would have become president when FDR died the following spring, and there would have been no Cold War. And Professor Gaddis was very concerned about this view among his students because he believed it to be extremely inaccurate, and was giving the wrong message about where the Cold War went to and what came from and how history evolved from there. Anyway, once I finished the Marshall Plan, I really was itching to do a biographical work, particularly based on this fascinating man, because what I did know about him was enough to get me very curious. But I knew I couldn't possibly write a book like this without using the Russian archives to find out what the story was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And although I hadn't planned to make great use of them, the FBI archives turned out to be very, very useful in my research. I should emphasize that I couldn't write this book today with the Russian archives being effectively closed, certainly to foreign researchers, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
How did you find what you needed to find in the Russian archives, and what year was it that you went there?
Well, when I was writing the Marshall Plan, I used a Russian archival specialist to send me back documents. I gave her very specific details about what I was looking for, and she was able to find some extremely important documents. And we basically reprised that relationship in working on Wallace. You know, I would go through an episode of his life. I had specific questions about what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time, what the archives would say on it. There are two main foreign policy archives in Russia that I use, but she was sending me back those documents, and they turned out to be an absolute gold mine. Very disturbingly, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, she, who's well into her 70s, had to flee the country because the work that she was doing for me and other Western researchers became retroactively criminalized. So very, very sad story.
Where does she live today, can you say?
Yeah, Tel Aviv.
Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Here is some audio, I think it's about a minute, from a speech that Henry Wallace gave, just a little tiny excerpt, Hotel Commodore in New York in 1942. And you'll see why I wanted you to hear this and the people listening, and then you can follow up with the Russia connection after we hear this.
If we were to measure freedom by standards of nutrition, education, and self-government, we might rank the United States and certain nations of Western Europe very high. But this would not be fair to other nations, where education has become widespread only in the last 20 years. In many nations a generation ago, 9 out of 10 of the people could not read or write. Russia, for example, was changed from an illiterate to a literate nation within one generation. And in the process, Russia's appreciation of freedom was tremendously increased.
Your reaction to what he just said?
Yeah. This is very typical of the things that Wallace said about the Soviet Union over the course of his career. It was also very typical of views among what you might call elements of the liberal intelligentsia going back to the 1920s, the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. And basically there was an element of the American liberal intelligentsia that believed that we could really set aside the extreme Bolshevik rhetoric and look at what's actually going on in Russia. And what they saw was a nation that was hungry for industrial and agricultural progress, a nation that felt it had to catch up with the West, and in particular the United States, as fast as possible, and often used extreme methods of getting there. For example, agricultural collectivization which Henry Wallace thought was unfortunate but very necessary. But that these extreme methods had to be understood as being part of a much more positive Russian dedication to what Wallace called economic democracy, spreading economic democracy. That is, spreading prosperity to the great masses of the population. And Wallace and others who shared his positive view of Russia really fundamentally believed that these initiatives that the Russians were taking were being driven by experts. And Wallace believed passionately that economic progress around the world had to be driven by experts. Now, in the United States, where we had this complicated democratic political machinery where we constantly had to compromise on things, made this very messy. He was fascinated with the Soviet Union because, of course, they didn't have this messy democratic process and they could let the experts do their work. That was at least how Wallace saw things.
Why did he think they had freedom?
He did not believe that they had political freedom. He equated this idea of economic democracy with a type of freedom. That was the spreading of democracy to the working classes, the peasants, et cetera, that would eventually enable them to live a freer life. He believed that over time, Russia would evolve towards more political freedom as we had in the United States, but he was very critical of elements of political freedom in the United States. That is, he believed that our individualist ethos had been taken too far, and that it naturally led to the catastrophe, for example, of the Great Depression, that we couldn't have this individualist ethos guiding a society developing according to what was essentially planlessness. He believed that planlessness was irresponsibility. So he admired the Soviets very much in that they, at least in his view, had experts making national plans for the development of the country.
Fascinated by the fact that he was a 5% tipper. And I bring that up because I want you to tell us what he was like personally.
Yeah. So Wallace loved humankind, but humans not so much. If he were alive today, I think he would be diagnosed with what we today call Asperger's syndrome. Wallace was a genius when it came to studying things, inanimate objects, corn, chickens. I mean, he invented a breed of chicken that eats less and lays less eggs. It's much more efficient. But he never really understood human beings. He had great difficulty detecting duplicity. And though he did talk quite a bit about the importance of serving the interest of humankind generally, and the phrase that he used was the common man at home and abroad, and he accomplished very much in this area. For example, in Mexico, he was instrumental in setting up a Rockefeller Foundation project to increase agricultural productivity in Mexico, which really had revolutionary effects. But when it came down to his personal interactions with human beings, for example, tipping in a restaurant, he didn't seem to understand them and often didn't seem to have great empathy with them.
What was his personal relationship with FDR?
It was initially very pragmatic, we could say. Wallace, at the time that he was in contact with Roosevelt during the campaign in 32, was still a registered Republican. Republicanism was deep in his family's history. He was somewhat skeptical about FDR because Wallace's concerns were first and foremost about agriculture in the United States, and he was unconvinced that FDR really cared about agriculture. But FDR very much appreciated the fact that Wallace was not the type of man to be confined by conventional thinking. His good friend Henry Morgenthau eventually became Treasury Secretary under him, was such a conventional thinker, but Wallace wasn't. And FDR liked the fact that Wallace would be somebody who would experiment. And throughout his time in Washington with FDR, FDR would really admire Wallace for his open mind, for his intellectualism. And the two shared a common interest in mysticism, believe it or not. But FDR always knew when to shut things off. That is, Wallace is going too far. And he was never concerned the way other major leaders in the Democratic Party were, that Wallace might at some point really muck things up, because FDR always believed that he was the government, particularly when it came to foreign policy. And if people under him had the wrong ideas, he could just ignore them in the most charming fashion. And that's pretty much describes how his relationship with Wallace evolved. Wallace did create problems for him over the course of his 4 administrations, but he was typically able to cover them up. And by the time we get into FDR's 3rd and 4th term, Wallace actually becomes quite critical to shoring up his liberal flank. You know, he's the last major committed vocal New Dealer in the government. So he becomes, in effect, indispensable, not just to FDR, but after FDR dies, to President Truman.
Where was he educated?
He went to Iowa State College and studied agriculture. But you know, he had academic interests, but his interests were fundamentally practical. That is, how can we improve farming on his own family farm, in Iowa more broadly. And then eventually he became fascinated with the whole idea of improving agricultural technology literally around the world. I mean, he was quite well read, for example, on the history of agricultural development in China, and took a deep interest in how agricultural techniques were developing or not developing in the country.
How many years was he Agriculture Secretary under FDR?
Yeah, for the entirety of his first 2 terms. So that's from 1933 to 1940.
After his 4 years as vice president, how long was he Secretary of Commerce?
So he becomes Secretary of Commerce. It's an enormously controversial nomination. And I tell this story of how he was barely confirmed in early 1945. March of 1945, I believe. Roosevelt dies in April of 45. Truman, who doesn't think terribly much of Wallace, that's pretty much mutual between them, feels he needs to keep Wallace on again to shore up his liberal flank, and manages to keep him on, despite Wallace's relentless attacks on his foreign policy, until September of 1946, when he finally fires him after a speech that really sets off political alarms around the United States.
Who was he married to?
his wife was named Ilo. She really had a deep affection for what she considered the stolid aspects of his personality. Her friends were very much against her marrying him. They thought he was very strange. He had bizarre scientific diets involving eating animal feed and the strawberries and things of that nature. He dressed very strangely. He talked very strangely. But she really had an affection for what she saw as the genuineness of the man. She was always very, very concerned, however, about his growing mystical bent, his interest in things like theosophy. She was convinced it was going to get him into trouble and never really wanted his political career to go too far. She became terrified the first time she heard, not from her husband, but from an advisor of her husband, I think this was back around 1937, that he was considering running for president in 1940.
I've got to bring up 10% of your book was devoted 61 pages to I have to say this was all new to me, so it was fascinating. Do you pronounce it Rorich?
So in my Russian pronunciation would be very bad. It was pronounced in the United States Rerik, and it was quite similar to that in Russian. So his name in Russian was roughly Nikolai Rerik, and it became anglicized, as it were, to Nicholas Rerik when he moved to New York in 1920.
Before you get into it, I did notice that there still is a museum,
Yeah,
Upper West Side of New York, what about 107th Street or something like that, in a
yeah,
townhouse.
wonderful.
So if people listening get interested in what you're going to tell them, there's still some place to go to see his work, and it's also online. But anyway, tell us who he was and how Wallace got involved with him and what impact all that had.
Right. So this massive chapter on Nicholas Roerich was supposed to have been a few pages in a chapter on his time as agricultural secretary. But the material I found in Russia was just jaw-dropping. And it took me about a year to write this particular chapter. It became the longest chapter in the book. So Nicholas Roerich was first and foremost known as an artist in Russia and a stage designer. His most famous works are instantly recognizable for these luminous depictions of an ancient, primitive, spiritual Russia. He left St. Petersburg in 1916 during the turmoil surrounding the Bolshevik coup. He lived for the next few years in the Nordic region in London, and then in 1920 moved to New York. And he already had a pretty significant following in New York and around the United States. He immediately set off on a 28 city tour of the United States shortly after arriving in New York. Wallace becomes first acquainted with him through a Russian agronomist in the United States named Dmitry Borodin. In 1927, he goes to this new museum named after Roerich. The original museum was much, much larger than what you see today on the Upper West Side. It was really a grand museum. So in 1927, he goes to the museum and becomes utterly transfixed in front of a Tibetan prayer mat that's in the lobby. And the receptionist becomes deeply concerned, alerts the vice president of the museum, who comes down to speak to him to see if he's unwell. And he says, no, he was just experiencing vibrations. To make a very long story very short, he eventually establishes contact with Roerich, who is not only an artist, but a major spiritual figure. He's a theosophist. He and his wife, Helena, have developed their own branch of theosophy, which they call Agni Yoga. And they believe that the ancient Mahatmas, the masters who lived many, many generations ago in and around Tibet, could communicate to the chosen um, uh, divine truths. And Helena, Nicholas's wife, was the main vehicle for those truths. Wallace became an absolute devotee of Reric and Agni Yoga. Over the course of his relationship with the Rerics, he wrote over 200 letters that are really quite remarkable in style. They're very slavish and devotional. These became known as the Guru letters, and they would come back to haunt Wallace throughout his career. What makes the story utterly fascinating is how it intersects with Wallace's politics. That is, in 1934, he appoints Reric to head a seed foraging expedition in Central Asia to get drought-resistant seeds for the Midwest of the United States. This is a cover for Reric's true mission, which is to recreate the mythical Shambala in Central Asia, taking parts of Manchuria, Mongolia, and southern Siberia. So he wants to create essentially a new theocratic state. And Wallace not only knows about it, but is deeply supportive of it. And basically he dupes Congress into funding this expedition. FDR is fascinated with mysticism, knows that Wallace and the Rerics are interested in this, but doesn't take it very seriously. FDR thinks, this is just a harmless little obsession of theirs, but it's not going to go anywhere. But it blows up. Basically, Japanese military intelligence in the region and Soviet military intelligence become deeply concerned with what this man is up to. They start planting stories in the local and foreign press. It becomes a huge scandal, humiliates Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace, I then discovered, got the IRS commissioner to go after Reric, slap him with a $50,000 tax collection order. Nicholas was never allowed to return to the United States nor the Soviet Union. So the expedition was disbanded, and he and his wife Helena spent the rest of their lives in exile in India. And Wallace spent much of the rest of his career trying to dissociate himself from this venture.
Who was Louis Horch?
So Louis Horch was an indispensable early financial patron of Nicholas Reric. He provided he was a currency trader, but was very interested in Nicholas's spiritualism, but more interested in his art and how this could be monetized. So he contributed over $1 million of his own money to construct the museum. He borrowed a lot more. But he wrote his various contractual agreements with Nicholas Reric in such a way that whereas it would look like he was helping him, he set himself up to be in a position to profit from Reric's success or to disengage entirely if things went in the wrong direction. And in the early 1930s, particularly as the Depression set in, this venality starts to take over. Horch manages through FDR's mother, Sarah. Horch manages to, knowing that Sarah is very interested in spiritualism, and Reric makes contact with her in order for him to get direct contact with FDR. So the two of them eventually start meeting in 1934. FDR, of course, is he's interested in mysticism, but he's a very wily man. And I think he understands that this is a useful connection because it allows him to keep tabs on what Wallace is doing to make sure he won't go too far. Horch eventually basically takes over this Rarick cult. In 1935, as things start blowing up in Central Asia, and these horrible articles come out about what Nicholas Roerich might be up to, he takes over the whole museum, takes over the art collection, assists Wallace in getting the IRS after Roerich. And at one point in January of 35, he actually goes to the president and tells him that Justice Sam Rosenman, who's very close to President Roosevelt, is going to be adjudicating in a case to determine whether he can take over the museum. And FDR tells him, this is simple, I'll handle it. And Rosenman winds up deciding the case completely in Horch's benefit. I'm not a lawyer myself. I'm certainly not a tax lawyer, but I did go through mounds of documents related to the case, and I must say, and it's an extremely weak case. Roerich looks like what he was, a man who simply wasn't interested in finances, and Horch used that to his advantage. But he maintained a very close relationship to Wallace throughout his career. Wallace gave him posts in the U.S. government throughout the 1930s and 40s.
How visible was this story back in the 30s and 40s, meaning the Wallace connection with Roerich?
So it blew up in the summer of 1935. When articles came out in the Chicago Tribune and then the New York Times, written by a Peking-based American journalist named Powell. And the article is just a classic piece of KGB disinformation. And I say that with great respect for the way the KGB does its job. In this regard, there are clear elements of truth in it. That Roerich obviously did have political motives. He was not just foraging for seeds. The American botanists who were working under Roerich did fall out with him, and they were recalled by Wallace. But there are elements of the story that are false, clearly false. For example, that the botanists had resigned. They hadn't resigned. They were recalled by Wallace. That Roerich's son, George, who was on the expedition, had been a czarist officer before the revolution. He was 15 at the time that he left Russia. So there are clear elements of falsehood here. So after that article comes out, the entire expedition starts collapsing, and the American public becomes familiar with this story. Fascinatingly, since Wallace is not really implicated in what's going on, beyond the statement at the beginning of the article that he had created the expedition, Wallace decides not to challenge any aspect of it. Just condemns Nicholas Roerich for getting involved in politics, which Wallace had supposedly known nothing about. And as I said earlier, he really spends much of the rest of his career trying to disown his relationship with Nicholas Roerich. But I have to emphasize that the story I'm able to tell now really did require these Russian archival documents. If you go through all the biographical material that had been written about Wallace before my book, you'll see Wallace presented as being well-meaning but naive, in that, he appointed this man to run a seed foraging expedition, and he went off and did all this crazy stuff. Poor Wallace. But that wasn't the story. Wallace was very much part of Rarick's initiative to create Shambala. He contributed his own money to invest in a cooperative, a big cooperative economic venture that Rarick was initially going to produce in Manchuria, but had to move it to Mongolia when the press turned against him in Manchuria. Wallace tried to get Henry Ford to invest in Rarick's initiative. Ford turned him down coldly. Wallace got political tutorials from the young vice president of the Rarick Museum about how Central Asia worked, whether Mongolia was part of China, and so on and so forth. They used code names for these various entities and the people involved in the story. For example, FDR's code name was the Wavering One. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, was the Sour One. Wallace's so-called esoteric name, indicating his relationship to the cult, was Galahad.
So what would it have been like if is there a place called Shambala today?
No, there is not.
And if there was, and he was able to create it, what would life be like there?
He wouldn't have been able to create it because it would have set off World War II much earlier than it had been set off. That is, the mission that Rarick was on was extremely dangerous. Manchuria was widely considered to be a geopolitical cauldron of intrigue at the time, with 4 major world powers contesting for influence and sovereignty in the region. You had Japan, China, the Soviet Union, and Britain as well, because of its interest in Tibet. So if Rarick had gotten any further than he had, war would almost certainly have ensued, possibly between the Japanese and the Soviets, which was always a possibility.
So did this, well, a couple of quickies on the museum. Who sponsors that museum today?
Going back to, I believe it's the 1940s, if I'm correct, this new museum was established based on a small number of paintings that had been kept together, and they managed to get public support for it. So it survives today based on donations and lectures and things like that. But you can, it's actually a free museum today. But I should emphasize, it's only a pitiful replica of what was originally there, and the so-called Master Building, which is just a few blocks south on the west side, which you can still see today, which is a beautiful Art Deco building.
Should I assume you've been there?
Yes.
And is it worth going to?
I love it. I think Nicholas Rarick's art is beautiful, and it's historically quite fascinating. It's a very small museum. I mean, you can easily see the whole thing in an hour. You won't get any understanding of the political nature of what he was up to. You'll get a little understanding of his spiritual interests, not terribly much, but it will definitely give you a good sense of Rarick as an artist.
How much of Wallace's ability to get money for Rarick was sold on the from our government, was sold on the basis that, as you say in the book, that he was looking in China, in that area, for drought-resistant grasses. And
yeah.
What does that mean, and why would we be caring at that time about drought-resistant grasses?
Right, because of the creation of the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. So this was fortuitous. Under Wallace at the Department of Agriculture was a man named Knowles Ryerson, who had for years tried through the department to get funding for a seed foraging expedition of some sort to look for drought-resistant seeds, to see if we could make the Midwest less vulnerable to droughts. He was never able to succeed in getting the funding. Then it was suggested to him by Francis Grant at the Rarick Museum that Wallace might combine the interest of the department in looking for these seeds with Nicholas Rarick's interest in recreating Shambala. And so Wallace takes ownership of this initiative, gets Ryerson on board, but then panics Ryerson by introducing him to Rarick and telling Ryerson that Rarick's going to lead this expedition. Ryerson is utterly appalled. He's convinced that Rarick is a shyster. And he goes and leaks this to State Department contacts. The State Department becomes extremely concerned with this idea. And Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, never trusts Wallace again after this initiative. It creates enormous tension between the State Department and the Department of Agriculture.
Let me stop for a moment and ask you about yourself. Where does the name Steil, S-T-E-I-L, come from?
My father, I suppose it would be about 15 years ago now, went looking on some genealogical site for long lost family he was sure he had somewhere, and found that there was another part of the family he knew nothing about that pronounced the name Steil. We pronounce it Steele. Through that part of the family, he got various family documents and found that it had originally been a Polish name Stolowicki, but the family was quite Germanophile, and so a lot of family documents were in German, and so they changed the name to Steil when they moved to the United States.
Where are you from originally?
I'm from New York, but Long Island in particular. As you can imagine, being a product of Long Island suburbia, when I had to write on agricultural policy, I had to do some research because I could barely distinguish animal, vegetable, and mineral.
Where did you go to school?
I did my undergraduate degree in economics at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania, and then did my master's and my PhD in economics at Oxford.
Have you taught?
No, I have lectured a lot, but I've spent my whole career in think tanks. In the 1990s at Chatham House, otherwise known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, and then in '99 came to the Council on Foreign Relations, and I've been there since then.
How would you describe to people who don't have any idea what the Council on Foreign Relations does or is or where it's located? What can you give us on that?
So the Council on Foreign Relations is a nonprofit membership institution. It is not in any way related to the U.S. government or any government. We don't take any money from governments. As I say, we're a membership organization. We have members around the United States, and we have offices in New York, which was the original location since 1921, and in Washington. Part of the organization is what you would call a think tank, a research institute dedicated to the study of international relations and American foreign policy.
What do you say to those conspiracy theorists that say the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, runs the world and is all a part of the corporate establishment, and that they really run the government?
Well, if that were true, they've done a darn good job of hiding it from me for all these years. You can understand where the original ideas perhaps came from, because if you go back to, for example, World War II, that period that I've been writing about, council members were quite influential in their individual capacity. And they would get together at the council to discuss issues related to the development of American foreign policy, produce their own reports that were naturally influential because the members were influential. But the notion that the council as such was running something, no, certainly not true. And today I should emphasize that there's, the studies department today is a much larger part of the council than it was generations ago. And it's completely separate from the membership. So, whatever the members' interests are, that doesn't have any influence over the conduct of, for example, my research.
Back to my original question to you, and that is, why did FDR choose Henry Wallace to be his vice president? How did he? John Nance Garner was vice president for 2 terms.
Right.
What happened to him, and then how did FDR engineer it, or did others come to him and suggest it, that he be?
No, FDR definitely engineered it. So FDR's view was, look, I've done my George Washington standard 2 terms. I've done my service. I coexisted with John Nance Garner, a Southern conservative, for 2 terms. It's my turn. If the country wants to draft me for a 3rd term, he wasn't going to nominate himself. He said, if the country wants to draft me, they're going to have to take my choice as vice president. Wallace was not his first choice. Wallace was not his second choice. Wallace was his 3rd choice at best.
Who were the first 2?
So Cordell Hull, FDR said many different things to many different people, but the evidence really does suggest strongly that Cordell Hull was his first choice. Jimmy Burns, Senator Burns, also a Southerner, but of a much more intellectual internationalist outlook than John Nance Garner, was his 2nd choice. Supposedly, Burns had been eliminated for religious reasons. There was a belief at the time that Burns would alienate Catholics in the United States because he was born Catholic but married a Protestant and then apparently converted to Protestantism afterwards. This would come back to haunt Burns again in 1944 when he was seriously considered. And then Wallace was apparently a 3rd choice. What we do know for sure is that FDR wanted a genuine internationalist as vice president. FDR knew we were headed into a very dangerous phase in world affairs, that the United States entering the war was a very distinct possibility. And so it was essential to him that he have an internationalist on the ticket. But there were other attractions that Wallace had to him. First of all, FDR was conscious of the fact that the New Deal was no longer something that he could tend to. That he was first and foremost going to be a foreign policy president now. Wallace was by far the most visible, vocal New Dealer around him at the time. So he would shore up the left flank of the administration. And it was believed that Wallace, being an Iowan, a farmer, would help in the Midwest. And that didn't really turn out to be the case in the election, because Dewey won 10 states. 7 of them were in the Midwest. So by this time, the Midwest, the agricultural community is already becoming quite suspicious of Wallace. And when fast forward to 1948, when Wallace runs for president, he barely gets 1% of the vote in Iowa, his home state.
Let me jump from FDR's selection in 1940 to 44 when he dumps him. How does that work? And you describe it, of course, in the book, how FDR operates under those circumstances.
It's just a remarkable story, 1944. I have read an incredible amount about what FDR said to many, many people about who he wanted and why he wanted it. And I still can't say definitively this is what FDR believed. However, he had been convinced by the leadership of the Democratic National Committee that Wallace was a liability, that Wallace was way too far to the left, that he was going to be a vote loser, particularly in the South, which was beginning now to disconnect from the Democratic Party. And in particular, they were concerned that he was much too close to the Soviets. Now, the reason why the DNC leaders were so concerned about Wallace remaining on the ticket is that they could see Roosevelt's deteriorating condition. They really didn't believe that he was going to survive a 4th term. So they were quite convinced that whoever was vice president was going to ascend to the presidency. Of course, they were right in that regard. Now, FDR ultimately wound up endorsing 4 separate people in 4 separate ways for vice president. He created complete chaos at the 1944 Democratic Convention. So he endorsed Wallace in a very backhanded way that hurt Wallace, and FDR knew that it would. He had a message read to the convention saying that if he, FDR, were a delegate, he would vote for Henry Wallace. But of course, he was not a delegate, and he was confident that the delegates would weigh the pluses and minuses of the various alternatives and reach a good decision. And the convention took that as FDR's quite FDR way of saying goodbye, Henry Wallace. He endorsed Jimmy Burns verbally several times and infuriated Burns by undercutting him each time he gave him his private reassurances. And he endorsed William Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, who had no following in the party. Wallace just, FDR just liked him. He said he was a poker buddy. He was young and had a good head of hair, and that would help him against the Republicans in the fall. He actually said that. And then there was the man, of course, who was eventually nominated at the convention, Harry Truman. And he was the #1 choice of the DNC leaders. And Truman had many characteristics that made him desirable. He was sort of in the South without being of the South. That is, he was seen as being acceptable in the North. He was acceptable to African American leaders. He was acceptable to the labor unions. He was inoffensive, but Southerners considered him one of their own as well. He was considered a very responsible senator. He had headed the so-called Truman Committee during the war, which investigated the use of government funds and procurement and the like. And FDR very much respected him for how he handled that. And he was seen as being a safe pair of hands. And the convention, as I describe in the story, was a wild, open one, which went to ballots. Wallace was leading after the first ballot, and then Truman won on the second ballot. The DNC leaders had orchestrated things quite carefully to produce this result, but as you see from the story, it was not a situation that the DNC leaders were able to control. And at several times during the convention, it looked like it was going to go out of control and that Wallace might somehow skirt through.
And that's why you mentioned earlier about Oliver Stone and the whole idea
Right.
that had he been the vice president, the world would have been different after FDR died.
Well, yes, and Stone and others have made claims that the DNC leadership was corrupt and that the delegates had been bribed to vote for Wallace in particular. And even David McCullough, the famous biographer of Truman, repeats these stories that supposedly the chairman of the delegation had been offered postmasterships and ambassadorships to vote for Truman. And I actually spent many weeks with my research associate at the council and an intern investigating these claims. First, we went through all the chairmen and said, right, does anybody become a postmaster or an ambassador under FDR or Truman? Postmasterships were ridiculous. That was a 19th century sinecure. It had become part of the civil service, over 6 decades before, so that post wasn't available for patronage. Ambassadorships were more interesting. I went through all the chairmen, and only one had become an ambassador under FDR or Truman, and he had voted against Truman. But then I decided to take it much further, and I went through every single one of the 1,176 delegates, which was not easy. We were making phone calls to little archives around the country to try to figure it out. And what I identified even shocked me. I found one delegate, Richard Patterson from New York. We don't know his voting record because New York did not record the individual votes of the delegates, who did become an ambassador under FDR and Truman, but I don't know how he voted. But no, all the others who became ambassadors under FDR or Truman voted against Truman. So this myth that Stone and others have perpetuated is completely without foundation. I have no doubt that the DNC leaders twisted arms, cajoled, urged, but really what they needed to do to convince the delegates was to persuade them that this was what FDR actually wanted. And at the end of the day, this is what FDR did, in fact, authorize. So it was a clean convention.
Before we finish, I must ask you about his time as Secretary of Commerce, his relations with Harry Dexter White. You've written a lot about Harry Dexter White, and why there were so many so-called communists in that Commerce Department during the Truman years.
Right. I should emphasize that for the most part, these weren't people who were brought in by Henry Wallace. They had been there long before. But Wallace really empowered a number of them. His primary economic advisor at Commerce was a man named Harry Magdoff, who was a longtime CPUSA member, member of the American Communist Party, and an active Soviet agent. And so I had been very unhappy when I had read previous biographies of Wallace, because I couldn't really understand his time at Commerce, why he was taking the various positions he was. So what I did was go through the FBI archives, since almost everybody under Wallace was having his phone tapped by the FBI. You could find out that on such and such day, Wallace said this, and find out what his advisors were saying that morning, or say the day before. And you found that they were manipulating him. sometimes for the benefit of the Soviet Union when they would push Wallace into areas of foreign policy, sometimes in favor of the unions to promote strikes. Harry Magdoff wanted there, for example, to be a national rail strike, something that Truman was trying to head off. And Harry Magdoff actually leaked to the Soviet Union's Wallace's very private cabinet papers from September 1945 to do with American atomic policy. Wallace was very much being used by these CPUSA members and Soviet agents and assets at Commerce. But he also deserves some blame in that he empowered them. Harry Magdoff, for example, became one of Wallace's speechwriters and advisors during his 1948 presidential campaign. Charles Kramer, who had worked for Florida Senator Claude Pepper, was a Soviet agent and became a speechwriter and advisor for Wallace during his 48 campaign. What's really quite remarkable is that none of these people under Wallace were ever prosecuted. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that the phone taps were inadmissible. So, for example, Harry Dexter White, who you mentioned, his phone was being tapped, but none of those taps were admissible in court. And the second is that Hoover had bigger fish to fry. He was going after Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace was never a Soviet agent. He was very much used by the Soviet Union, but he was not a Soviet agent. But what is quite interesting is that if Henry Wallace had become president, it is pretty widely accepted based on things that Wallace had said over the years that Harry Dexter White, who was a major Soviet asset, if not an agent, would have been his Treasury Secretary, and Lawrence Duggan, who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence, supposedly he rebuffed them but never reported that, would have been his Secretary of State. So throughout Wallace's time in government, he really is surrounded by people who are doing work for a foreign government, a hostile foreign government.
I'm going to give your time back to you in just a second. Two things. I was really surprised near the end to find out that he died of Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yes, he did. He did. And he did so very bravely, I must say.
How long did he have it before he passed?
So he had it for 1.5 years. He was climbing a pyramid in Guatemala, I believe it was in spring of 1964. He was diagnosed the following November at the Mayo Clinic, and then he died 1 year later.
And the last thing I want to ask you about is that he voted for Eisenhower in 1952.
We don't know how he voted in 1952. He never said. He made statements which were supportive of both Stevenson and Eisenhower, but in 1956 he openly supported Eisenhower against Stevenson.
People listening are going to have to buy the book to find out the rest of the story. The name of it is The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century. Benn Steil is our guest, Counsel on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.